Welcome. Welcome to week 4 here at MPAI 600 Applied Intelligence Program here at Georgetown University. I hope we've got a good week. I saw a lot of great comments in this discussion board this past week, so please, again, keep up the effort as we go through this through the rest of this course. So I just want to briefly cover current events, and I'm going to use a business intel example that's come from the business side. Solo, the movie, the Star Wars movie, and I should warn you, I'm a big Star Wars fan. So I want to talk about this movie, but mainly how it is actually not meeting expectations. It is not getting the sales that Disney is hoping to, and the amount of money Disney puts into acquiring the rights as well as producing films like this actually might turn out to be a loss. And the question is why? Why has the Star Wars franchise been so profitable so far, and then Disney gets a belly flop in this for this case? And I've heard a lot of theories. Maybe the movie wasn't as bad. Maybe it wasn't marketed as well. There was some turmoil. But one of the theories, and this was put out by Bloomberg, was that the brand, the Star Wars brand, is associated with Christmas. And for those of you who follow Star Wars, you see that it's the release of each film is on Christmas. And there was a belief that if you put it on Christmas, people associate Star Wars with the Christmas blockbuster or the Christmas movie season, and that would drive up sales and at least have a good amount of audience retention. The fear is that by trying to get this movie out so early in May, and on the perceived summer blockbuster list, they diluted the brand, or they lost the brand association. And that's what is one of the drivers for this, what could be a monetary flop for Disney. And that just be, again, it's an example of, we talk about business intelligence. We're talking about the factors that lead to businesses to be successful or product launches to be successful. And something as simple but important as the psychology of a brand being associated with a certain time of year or a certain event is what drives sales. And to put this in May might have diluted that brand. So just an interesting case study coming up. I just want to make sure, again, it didn't make all the headlines as some of the other news stories out there, but from a business perspective, it's important to understand why, again, this product that had been so far so hyped, or supposedly so hyped, why it's not doing so well. So just point to consider as we go forward. Paper 1, the collection strategy. Everyone's gotten their grades back. If there's questions or issues, please let me know. But again, I think the biggest issue, and I have this every time, the requirements are way, way, way too broad. You have to imagine that you're putting a collection asset and somebody's life in danger to answer a very specific question. Again, too many questions dealt with large, broad topics. Is Iran cheating on the nuclear deal? Is the Chinese expanding in the South China Sea? Those are far too broad. You really want to narrow it down so you can again put a collection asset. One of the things, a couple of people came up with this, and I'm not sure if this was just coincidental, but Iranian support to the Houthis. And the Houthis, for those of you who don't know, are a Yemeni tribe, Shia tribe that's, I don't want to say supported by Iran, but receives support from Iran, that's against the current Yemeni government. And the Houthis have acquired small arms, they've acquired missiles, they've acquired all other technologies from Iran. And, I got a bunch of requirements that were broad. Describe Iranian support to the Houthis. You can really narrow that down to describe Iranian missile component end items being shipped over land to support the Houthis. That's a much more narrow requirement than is Iran supporting the Houthis or where are the Iranian arms shipments. Again, as narrow as possible to answer that question in order to sharpen your analysis as well as provide a collection asset that's capable of answering it. I commented this on everyone's paper, so if I wrote too broad for your analysis, just keep in mind you're not alone. 90% of people had far too broad requirements. And as I mentioned again, focus your requirements, not just what is Iranian support to the Houthis, but focus on smuggling of large ballistic missiles, or even tighter, the end item components of missiles are being smuggled overland through what or over water, through what port in Yemen. That's a lot more of a narrow requirement. I keep the same topic for all requirements. One or two people kind of jumped around a little bit. As I mentioned, a topic could be Iranian. Keep your topic relevant to if you're doing Iranian nuclear proliferation or domestic gang issues. Don't just jump around from one or another. A couple people did that, and maybe I wasn't clear in the guidance. But I wanted you to focus, really drill down on one issue. A lot of people brought this up, social media exploitation, OSINT. We didn't talk about it in the Lowenthal or in detail. We didn't talk about it in week one, and maybe I should start talking about that in class. I just want to caution that OSINT, or social media exploitation, are good for some issues, not so good for others. Social media is good for understanding Russian influence operations in the Baltics. And a couple people wrote about Russian influence operations. Yeah, that's where social media exploitation, OSINT, is probably a great capability. OSINT's not very, or social media exploitation is not very good, obviously, in North Korea, because not very few people are on Facebook or various social platforms. Social media exploitation is not very good for MS-13. MS-13 tends to be run not on virtual relationships, but actual relationships. One-on-one through familiar tiles or friendly or friends and friends of friends that don't always show up in the internet. So again, certain groups or you can use social media exploitation, others you cannot. And I just want to go on a little bit of a tangent here. We might even teach this course later on, or develop a course on open source intel, social media exploitation for against counter ISIS, counter radical extremism, counter alt-right, those types of groups. And I would, if anyone knows of a group or a law enforcement agency that is using open source intelligence for early interdiction, and what I mean by that is, let's say someone has a proclivity, they wanted to join ISIS. They showed up on their social media, became very, very heavy populated with ISIS messaging. Instead of arresting that person or waiting for that person in a sting operation to start traveling to Syria or any of those places, does anyone know of law enforcement will just knock on the door and say, hey, I noticed you were posting a lot on this. Is there, what's the issue going on? Or in many cases, you go to that person's parent or imam or anything like that to try and interdict a young man or young woman from following, Islamic extremist organization or following an alt-right group. A lot of law enforcement does it for gangs. They do it for other type of criminal behavior where you try and interdict them so then you can take them off the course of joining a gang or getting involved in drugs. If anyone knows of a law enforcement agency that's doing that, not to criminally prosecute someone, but for early interdiction, please let me know. Because I've asked around, I've briefed at federal law enforcement training centers, I've briefed other places, and no one seems to be doing this, and I'm not sure why. So, a little bit of a tangent there. But yeah, I fully agree that social media exploitation, OSINT, is definitely an int that can be exploited, but it's not relevant in all case studies. So, review week 3. Again, 2 great historical examples, Pearl Harbor, Yom Kippur War. And my point for these week is not to give you a history lesson, but is to understand the pathologies and to understand the schisms for intel failure that were relevant back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and are still relevant now. So as I mentioned earlier, hint, hint, a lot of these historical case studies, I wanted you to view the lessons learned so you can apply them to what we're seeing now. So again, the Pearl Harbor case study, I think Dahl does an excellent overview of it, as well as the intel failures. And I like how he groups the intel failure schools. And you can apply this, again, to other cases as well. So he talks about the traditional school. This is the connect the dots, that there's too much information out there for analysts to work with, but and they're diluted in information and they can't connect the dots. That's an old cliche that you heard probably around 9/11, and that intel failure comes up in 9/11 as well. So that's the traditional schoolist. There's the reformist schoolist that argues it is the organization of intelligence agencies contribute to failure. And as I mentioned in my lecture, there's a lot of argument that said that there was intelligence collected at the federal level, but it was not disseminated down to the military commanders on the ground. And you could argue because of overclassifications, you could argue because intelligence wasn't organized to share across those boundaries. And again, there's a good argument to say, and this is made by the families of Admiral Kimbrell and General Short, that Washington kept the commanders in Pearl Harbor in the dark. And you can also see this in the 9/11 case study, which you'll see where maybe information was collected at the federal level, but it wasn't disseminated down to action arms that could have prevented a 9/11. Then you have the contrarian school, which is a little bit of the opposite of traditional school, is that information, the intel failure has to do with the collectors, the HUMINT, SIGINT, OSINT, that didn't collect enough information, or they were incompetent in a way on how they went about collecting that information. So those were all points in the intel cycle, points that I want you to cover in your next paper as well as on the final, that say, okay, what were the intel failures, or what were the causes of the intel failure? Kind of what school does it come from? Dahl has a little bit of a spin on it. He argues, and I think he correctly argues, that you have to look at the interface between the policy makers or the military leaders and the intel organization. That interface is what needs to be focused on, and when that interface is messed up, then you have an intel failure happen. And Dahl argues that in order for the military commanders to be receptive to the intel message, it has to be very specific, and it has to be couched in a way that they can take direct action, or they would be receptive to it, because it's not just generic strategic intelligence, but it's actual, there's going to be attack, it's going to occur at this time, it's going to be this composition. So that's what Dahl is arguing, and I think he has some good points. I would just argue that very rarely in the intelligence community do you get the specific, they're going to attack today on this date in this approach using these vectors. You don't get that type of specificity. And that brings me up to my last point that I didn't bring up in the lecture. I call it the Sharma School. It's been around a while. It's not something I coined, but for sake now, let's just call it the Sharma School. And what I mean by this is intel failure results, and I agree with the Dahl that the interface between policymakers and intel is very important. But intel has a obligation to provide reasonable recommendations to mitigate risk. So unlike Dahl, I don't think you ever get that very specific tactical intelligence. However, again, I think it was reasonable. There was enough intel, or it should have been communicated in a way for the Pearl Harbor commanders to do certain actions that could have prevented a Pearl Harbor attack. Again, cancel leaves on Sunday, increase long-range bombers, increase alerts that are, I think, reasonable for them to occur. Let's go. We're going to preview the 9/11 case study. I want to talk about that here. There was no specific intel saying that the 19 hijackers are going to hijack these planes on this day at this time. However, there was enough intel, in my opinion, to put some reasonable countermeasures to prevent a 9/11-like attack from occurring. And when I say reasonable countermeasures, those include securing the cockpits of aircraft. Not even securing all of them, but 20 to 30% of cockpits prior to 9/11. If you fly now, you will notice a drink cart in front of the cockpit to prevent, again, a 9/11 scenario, people trying to rush the hijacker. You put drink carts in front of cockpits in September of 2001, there is no 9/11-like scenario or 9/11 attack, because again you've put reasonable countermeasures, and if you're wrong on that, big deal. A drink cart sat in front of the cockpit, and there's no huge, massive expenditure in personnel or money. So that's where the Sharma School, again, call it whatever you want, but for the sake, call it Sharma School now, where you're putting, again, intel is driving reasonable risk reduction measures to prevent total catastrophe. And that's what kind of intel is supposed to be doing, using intel or intelligence to drive risk reduction measures. And that's not just in the case studies that we talk about here. That's in law enforcement. That's in the business intelligence community either. When you take your ethics course, you're going to talk about Enron, and you're going to talk about the housing crisis and Lehman Brothers. And arguably, they could have taken reasonable measures to reduce their exposure, in the Lehman Brothers case, to housing mortgages or subpar mortgages for Lehman Brothers' sake. They could have taken those reasonable measures. There's enough information that they could have done it. So that's kind of where I go with for Pearl Harbor or for the other case studies we talk about. Then the Yom Kippur War. Again, the over-reliance on human, I think some people said that, and I would agree as well, that, and this would go with the contrarian school of thought for intelligence failure, that there was a reliance on a collector. The collector couldn't report in until the day before, or really the day of, on the potential for an Egyptian attack against Israel, and that over-reliance on that single source human was a contributing factor to the Yom Kippur intel failure. Addiction to preconceived notions. This is what's brought up in the Avi Shlaim article. It's also brought up in that documentary that I had you watch on Al Jazeera. This is the Egyptians will not attack unless they can neutralize the Israeli Air Force. And then they thought this, they based all their information on that preconceived notion. This was a failure in analysis, failure of policymakers to actually implement any countermeasures to the Egyptian or Syrian attack. And I think that's probably one of the larger reasons, but I'll let you decide what you think the intel failure was. Organization of intel structures. This is brought up again in the Avi Shlaim. The lieutenant, and his name escapes me now, that information, the one on the Bar-Lev line, who saw everything, because of the disparate intel functions and complex chain of commands in the Israeli military, that information could not get up to people that can make decisions. And again, that's a lot to do with the organization of intelligence as it relates to collecting information on the Suez Canal line. And then I have to bring this up, A Boy Who Cried Wolf. And this would probably go along the category of stuff happens. The commanders on the ground and the intel failure did not want to cry wolf. They didn't want to say there was going to be an attack and then lose their credibility, especially because the cost to mobilizing for Israel is massive. Israel relies on reserves, so you take those people out, then there's no Israeli economy because all the men are now fighting. During a wartime, all cars are requisitioned, houses are requisitioned, food stocks are requisitioned. You don't want to be the person that says there's going to be attacked, be wrong about that, and have this massive disruption in the Israeli economy. So the circumstances were so high in that case, I'm not sure, and again, I'm playing hindsight here, any intel analyst would have made a call that the Egyptians and Syrians would have struck. And then you could also argue, again, it's all a myriad of reasons. And the one thing I ask is, if you write your paper on this and you say there's going to be a myriad of reasons, you still have to define one or two of them that you think are overriding causes of the intel failure. So that covers week 3, week 4. There's going to be a lot of work. I try not to give you too many readings in this class because I know if I give you a lot, you won't do any of it. This is probably the exception to the rule. A lot of readings, a lot of documentaries. 2 case studies, Iraq WMD and 9/11, 2 cases that might be history to a couple of you guys who are younger. Certainly not history to me. I lived through them. I experienced them at a visceral level. And but there are also these 2 case studies probably have the largest formation on the modern intelligence, U.S. intelligence community. And the pathologies that contributed to these intelligence failures, again, are relevant whether you're in the criminal section, business intelligence, etc. So Iraq WMD, the documentaries, the Rachel Maddow show, great documentary. Rachel Maddow's a political person, so I take everything with a little bit of salt, but the information is accurate, and I think is presented, if not fairly, at least in a way that shows the intel failure across the board. 60 Minutes Curveball, great 60 Minutes, but also a great book out there on Curveball if you got some free time and you're interested in this. I just read it last week. And this was published back in 2009. In fact, I'm going to put that on my recommendation list for this class. It's called Curveball, The Man Who Fooled the World. Great book. But the 60 minutes should give you enough information for this module. The committee report, the Senate Select Committee on WMD. It's a one chapter. That chapter is 200 pages. Focus on the blue boxes. Those are the headers and the key points from the paper. You don't have to read the whole thing. I can't ask you to read the whole thing, but just focus on that and go where your curiosity kind of takes you for that report. And then obviously the Sharma lectures. And I break this down into two facets. Politicization, which is the undue influence of politics on the intelligence community, and then failures within the intel community itself. And even though those are probably very closely related, I kind of break it down for the lecture's sake into those 2 facets. And then 9/11, 2 documentaries, the National Geographic and then the Nova NSA documentary. The readings, the doll. So you left off on it in the prior week. You're going to finish the book for this week. And then 1 chapter of the 9/11 Commission that deals with intelligence reform. And then the Sharma lectures. And while you're going through those lectures, just look at how 9/11 could have been prevented. Where were those facets where whether the intel organization or just better luck could have stopped a 9/11-like attack. So I look forward to your points in the discussion board. If there's questions or issues, please let me know.